Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Locals. Don't forget to subscribe to Locals. You can follow me there. I'll update not only the episodes that I'm doing weekly, but guest appearances I make in other people's channels. So you can follow all the stuff that I do there. You can engage with the channel directly there and support the channel directly there. So last week, or was it 2 weeks ago, episode 16, MIDR, both Euthanasia and Neo-Reactionary asked for a reading list in the live chat, and then a few people asked for one as well afterwards. And I thought, yeah, let's do that. Hello, Manoan. So we're going to start with my reading list. This is on technology. So basically what I'll do, and there's more than just technology, but what I'll try to do with each book or books is sort of highlight, why I think they're important. So there's Thorstein Veblen's The 1904 Theory of Business Enterprise, which I've only partly read, where he deals with this idea of the machine process. The machine process is that process by which you basically, instead of living in the rhythms of nature, you create this completely artificial process that has to be kept as regular and stable as possible without any variance. And so it's sort of opposed to nature. And when we get to, of course, I've brought up a lot of Baudrillard already. That's sort of where we get the idea of hyper-reality. Another good book, or this is an essay, E.M. Forster's 1909 work, The Machine Stops. It's a short essay, which, written at that time, predicts everything. It predicts people living in pods. It predicts the internet. It predicts people. It predicts the machine stopping and then people dying without the machine. I mean, it's amazing that somebody in 1909 wrote that. It's an extremely interesting and informative work. Aldous Huxley's 1932 work, Brave New World. Brave New World is essentially the world that we're living in now. And Aldous Huxley ought to know, because his brother Julian Huxley was closely connected to things like UNESCO, which is the education wing of the UN, and these broader globalist trends. And the main themes in Brave New World are that, consumerism and hedonism are used to control people in order to allow them to be manipulated by the elite manager class. C.S. Lewis, in his 1943, The Abolition of Man, discusses what would happen if a technological elite could somehow genetically engineer humanity from a certain point onward, which was a theme that was being talked about much in the 30s and 40s, but which even now hasn't yet happened. But that the main idea of that work is that the people who could do that, if it were a thing that could be done, would essentially be as gods to the rest of humanity afterwards, because they would have more influence over them than anybody else before. But in so doing, technology, rather than being a force for liberation and freedom, is in fact a force of servitude and control. All right, we also got M, Vingel, Adam Graham, Zero World, and Nathan C.J. Hood. Well, welcome all. All right. Now, this is the first really meaty text on technology. Jacques Ellul's On Technique. I've not read completely, but I'm familiar with some of the key ideas, such as technique and social plasticity and all these other things. And so what Jacques Ellul is doing is he's analyzing this process as relatively apolitical. I mean, he's not coming from an obviously, say, Marxist perspective, and he's not obviously coming from a reactionary perspective or a right-wing perspective. In other works, he identifies as a Christian anarchist, so you could argue that that's an implicit assumption, but it's not one that comes to the fore in this book. It's really more of just him analyzing the logic of the machine and the costs that it imposes on the rest of us. Probably the most important thing you can read about the machine right now. I've also mentioned Ivan Illich. Deschooling Society, 1971, is an interesting work of his, where he discusses, he's primarily criticizing public education, but not just public education as such, but how education is done. So he has a wonderful line at the beginning. He says, if somebody wants to major in history, why does he have to then pass, a standardized test with mathematics? Knowledge of mathematics is never going to come up in his professional career as a historian. There's this bundling together of these ideas is just useless. Tools for Conviviality, 1973. I have not read, but I'm familiar with some of the concepts in it from YouTube videos with Illich and such. And the basic premise of that is to get people to actually start, talking to each other again and not being isolated and deracinated. So this is a problem that's been going on for a long time. His 2005 interview, which is transcribed as Rivers North of the Future, is where I got the idea of the 3 era of tools: organon, distal, and systems. So again, that's a very important read as well. The second most important book to read on this topic is one everybody here is familiar with, is Jean Baudrillard's 1981 Simulacra and Simulation, which I've also read. I doubt I need to say much about this book since I've used it extensively in previous episodes. Joseph Tainter, his 1988 work, The Collapse of Complex Societies, that's where I get, which I've not read, but I've listened to lectures Tainter's given where he explains the theories that are expressed in this book, such as collapse, which is moving from a high energy state to a low energy state, and the ideas of energy consumption and how that creates a trap. James Howard Kunstler, his 3 books, The Long Emergency, 2005, Too Much Magic, 2012, and Living in the Long Emergency, 2020, are, in fact, it was through Kunstler that I heard about Tainter and Greer. So he's sort of a lay popularizer of their work. So he doesn't write in a very technical fashion. Well, he does use some technical jargon. He's primarily there to sort of mediate complicated technical concepts to a lay audience. The Long Emergency is his sort of, for lack of a better word, collapse pill narrative, where it's like, well, we're running out of resources and ultimately primarily energy resources. So that's his indebtedness to Tainter. We're going to be moving into a collapse, which is a low energy state. Too Much Magic is where he talks about the sort of scientific thinking that undergirds a lot of this. So he calls it cornucopianism, the idea that we have limitless energy and limitless resources, and we can always just have some techno wizard whip something up. And he's like, that's just not sustainable in the long run. And he makes a direct appeal to Joseph Tainter again, where it's called too much complexity. Complex systems build more complex systems to help to fix the problems of more complex systems, and you can't keep on doing this ad infinitum. And then Living in the Long Emergency is his attempt to sort of do a mea culpa about why peak oil hasn't happened yet. He sort of jumped the gun by predicting it, by giving a hard date for when that was going to happen, as well as writing about a lot of his boomer and Xer friends who he thinks are living lifestyles that indicate they might be a path forward for the long emergency. So those are what I would call the key books that deal with technology as such. Now, a lot of other people have been asking me too, well, how do you escape the simulation? What is it like to live in, Well, the first thing to do, and this goes back to my culture and simulation or simulacra episode, is we don't even know how to think like somebody outside of the simulation. And the material conditions have changed so much that we can't actually have people writing new books or novels or whatever that deal with life outside the simulation. Unless, of course, they've read books from people who did. So to that end, that's the only way. So by reading books is really the only way we're going to know how to think and act outside the simulation. Obviously, no surprise to anyone. First on the list here is the Bible. Of course, I've read that many times. That really doesn't need much to be said in its favor. It's the most popular sold book in the world. So the next thing is we have the great epic poems of the West. There's essentially 4 authors: Homer, Virgil, Dante, and Milton. Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I think, if anything, if there's a main theme in the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's that struggle and war are the result of men's passions not checked by reason. And he doesn't really have an answer to deal with that yet. He's commenting on how baneful that fact is. I've already talked about Homer in my second episode of the Casual Stream, so I would refer anyone to that. The Aeneid is sort of the founding myth of Rome. So Virgil wants to create a hero and a hero's journey whereby all the virtues of Rome are exhibited in his behavior. So Rome is powerful because Rome is good. And also lay the foundation for, in myth form, Rome's universal dominion over the world is a sort of like divine prophecy. Dante's The Divine Comedy is an attempt to, on the one hand, describe Catholic conception of the afterlife with purgatory, or hell, purgatory, and paradise, as well as make commentary on the Trojan War. The Greeks basically all end up in hell, the Trojans in limbo, and some even make it to heaven. And then also current politics in Italy. Some of the popes are put in hell, kind of a risky move back in the day. And sort of develop a sort of aesthetic sense, which culminates in his beatific vision, which is a sort of expression of Thomist philosophy and literature. Milton, his Paradise Lost, is basically taking the same trend of the poem, but then applying it to a biblical theme rather than a classical or an afterlife theme, which is the fall of man. And in it, Satan sort of is cast as the sort of classic hero with his willingness to go out and just take by force and what he wants. And then, Christ is being recast as this new counter hero. And so each one of these is including concepts from the other. Now, whereas Homer, Virgil, and Dante are all directly referring to the Trojan War one way or the other, Milton is not. But nonetheless, Milton is not ignorant of the influence. There's still the influences there on these works. Now, these are some of my picks from great 19th century novelists. I think Herman Melville's excellent. Moby Dick is a great novel. Bartleby the Scrivener, and then Billy Budd. So Moby Dick has a lot of themes in it. A lot of themes. The primary theme is about a man who's two men, Ahab and Ishmael. And the white whale sort of is an embodiment of God, and Ahab and Ishmael sort of are both embodying the sort of scientific rationalist mind. So Ishmael is a sort of a scholar and who wants to have this, universal encyclopedia, so to speak, where everybody's put in their little spot. But God's too big to be put in an encyclopedia. Ahab is sort of like the angry atheist that wants to kill God. At one point he says, I want to stab at the whale because the whale is the mask of the face that I want to stab beneath, i.e. the face of God. Both of whom fail in this endeavor, but Ishmael doesn't die, Ahab does. As well as just a great adventure story. Bartleby the Scrivener is a commentary on the meaningless, senseless work of bureaucracy in a exchange house. And then Billy Budd is a story about capital punishment, innocence, and guilt on a Navy vessel during the Napoleonic Wars. So Billy Budd is basically conscripted. He's pressed into service. So, it's against his will. He's on the ship, but then through a series of encounters with the officer of the ship who's in charge of the discipline of the crew, there's a crisis point, which I won't spoil for anyone who hasn't read it. But then Billy Budd is put on trial. And then the thing as well, is this whole thing a farce because Billy Budd was conscripted against his will? Is it, who's at fault? Is Billy at fault or is the British system at fault? And so it's this interesting, account. There's Poe and his collected poems. I like, for example, The Raven's a good one. And then also there's his novella, Arthur Gordon Pym, which is a parody of the Travelogue, where a guy goes to Antarctica. It's kind of ridiculous, but it's funny too. So there's that. We have Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, The Idiot Demons. Oh, sorry, and the Brothers Karamazov. Why didn't I say that? Brothers Karamazov. So what are the issues here? Well, Crime and Punishment, which was written before Nietzsche's first work by a good 8 to 10 years, he basically explores the idea of the will to power, the idea where you sort of claim that you can, because you're one of the superior men, you can dispense with the conventional morality. And it revolves around the protagonist, Raskolnikov, who commits a murder, and then what happens based on that philosophy, and then what happens. The Idiot is basically the idea, which is derived both from the New Testament with the life of Christ, and I think it was in the Republic, where one of Plato's dialogues where he says a perfectly just man would be killed. And the idiot is this perfectly just man who is perceived as being an idiot by everyone else, who is operating off, mean and vulgar motivations. The Demons is his prescient prediction of the rise of atheistic communism. And compared to the... It's interesting, right? Tolstoy believes that things couldn't get worse than his own day. And Dostoevsky's like, it could get much, much worse. And Dostoevsky is one of the few people that actually saw the dangers of atheistic totalitarian communism. And so while it's mostly kind of comedic how these bumbling revolutionaries don't get anywhere, they have extended monologues where they talk about their goals. And one of the revolutionaries says, rather prophetically, you'd have to kill 100 million Europeans to bring communism. Now, again, the Black Book of Communism says that there was about 100 million people that died under communism. So it's interesting how Dostoevsky got that close. Now, The Brothers Karamazov is probably his most mature work. And that's where he deals with the issues of, and of course, I've read The Great Inquisitor and parts of it in other streams. So that's one of the most famous subtexts of it. But it's, complicated ideas of, again, the will to power, which we saw in The Crime and Punishment. Ivan says, if God is dead, all things are permissible. We've heard that from new atheists all the time. And then the sort of answer to that. So it's the answer to that. And so in a lot of ways, you could argue that the ideas we find in Crime and Punishment and The Demons, these radicals and revolutionaries and atheists and all their ideas, The Brothers Karamazov is sort of like the answer to that. And then we have Alyosha, the monk, who embodies that answer. We have Tolstoy, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and the Resurrection. And so here, War and Peace is a sweeping epic of the Napoleonic War from 1805 until the end. It's primarily a drama about the key aristocratic families in there, though Tolstoy does express a theory of history, which is a kind of fatal necessity. He does also express certain ethical principles that he has at the time. Anna Karenina is a work primarily dealing with an adulterous woman and the cost that it imposes on everyone else, including herself. The Resurrection is a book he wrote after his religious change of opinions and his sort of reimagining himself as a sage, which is how a man who ruined a woman's reputation by advancing on her is in some sense trying to redeem himself by undoing the consequences of that action. And then there's numerous short stories which Tolstoy wrote, which are of course all very good. Some of my favorites are How Much Land Does a Man Need?, where a man is trying to mark off as much land as he can mark off before the end of the day, but ends up dying of heat stroke. That's a dark one. And we have Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, which is a sort of heroic telling of a revolutionary, where this time the revolutionary is the hero rather than the villain. And then we have Dickens, Oliver Twist, and The Christmas Carol. And I've read all of these, by the way. Well, not all of Tolstoy's short stories, but all the novels I've mentioned just far. Oliver Twist is a scathing criticism of the sort of operations of the British system under utilitarian capitalism, its heartlessness and its cruelty. And The Christmas Carol is kind of an extension of that. So if we look at some of the poets, well, obviously, we have Sophocles, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colono, and Antigone, all of which are part of the broader Oedipus cycle. Oedipus Rex is about the interplay between is it better not to know something, right? Because Tiresias, the blind priest, tells Oedipus, well, if you know what I'm going to tell you, you're going to wish you didn't know. And then also transgressing taboos. The Oedipus at Colono is about coming to terms with transgressing taboos and coming to terms with the gods. And then Antigone is about speaking truth to power, whereby there's a higher law, the law of the gods, which, she stands for, even though her uncle Creon stands against that. So it's a really interesting read here. And then there's, of course, Shakespeare. Shakespeare's history plays, tragedies, comedies, and then miscellanea called romances. I've read all of his history plays, all of his tragedies, and of the comedies I've read, The Comedy of Errors, read/listened to, The Merchant of Venice, and Midsummer's Night Dream, Much Ado About Nothing, and of the romances, The Two Noble Kinsmen, The Tempest, and Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Now, the history plays are primarily all about the War of the Roses, which was a tragedy, from his point of view, that occurred at the end of the English Middle Ages. From 14 55 till I think 1485. So this is what happens, and this is his sort of theatrical retelling of it in the plays Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, and Richard III. Now, there are technically two other history plays, Henry VIII, which deals with the birth of Queen Elizabeth, and King John. And I've read them as well, but they're not a part of that what's often called the Henriad. Then we have the tragedies. Now, the point of a lot of these tragedies is that these heroes themselves, these characters themselves, are otherwise heroic but have some fatal flaw, and it's that fatal flaw that brings them down. So, for example, in Julius Caesar, it's his pride. He thinks no one can touch him, and when the man says, "Hey, I got a note, someone's trying to kill you," he's like, "I'll read it later. I don't care. I mean, I'm Caesar. What's going to happen to me?" And he gets taken out. We have in Othello, his key failing is he's gullible, right? He's deceived by Iago into believing that Desdemona is unfaithful to him. He's easily deceived through flattery. That's his weakness. And so it's what the tragedies are here to show us is that by pursuing certain courses, certain ends become necessitated, which is what we see in the Christmas Carol with the ghosts of Christmas future. And so the utility of a tragedy is that you don't have to go down that road to see what going down that road would end up with. And so it's like, well, they're cautionary tales. Comedy, in this case, doesn't necessarily mean funny. It means a happy ending. Initially, comedy meant a happy ending. Though comedy as a sort of humorous reversal or twist is something we also see here as well in Shakespeare. I'm less fond of his comedies, though I love his comedies. The Merchant of Venice is my favorite. His romances are interesting in that they're sort of just floating on their own. They have tragic elements, they have comedic elements, so they kind of defy the tragedy or comedy classification. Of the ones that I've read, I think Pericles of Tyre is probably my most favorite. So for politics, we have, well, of course, Plato, the Republic, and the Laws. I've only read parts of the Republic, but this is sort of a foundation for Western political thought, and as well as Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics, which I have read all those. The main premise of the Republic is that Plato is using the city-state as a metaphor for which to describe justice in the soul. And so in the ancient world, the idea was that the city made the man. So you had to educate the man through this public life in the city. And so the city was then the institution. So once you defined what a good man was, it was the city that made that the lawgivers were supposed to then make laws, which would facilitate the education of such men. So that's why, of course, Plato uses the soul and the city as the city as a metaphor for the soul. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is laying down the sort of classic distinction of the middle road. So rather than having, going to the right and to the left, you go to the middle. And the middle is not just some middle point. It's also like an elevated middle point, which is why it's called the golden mean. Imagine like a triangle where at the top is the middle and on either side is the right and the left. And the main principle in the Nicomachean Ethics is there are excesses, there's the mean, and there's deficiencies. Excesses and deficiencies are both bad. Excesses are less bad than deficiencies because it's having too much of a thing rather than too little. And you can always dial too much back, but you can't easily add more to too little. And at the end of the ethics, he basically says, well, then how do we do this? And he says, well, we need to have good laws. We need to have a city-state, which is moving into the politics. The politics is a sort of empirical study of works of political life are all around the ancient Mediterranean, where Aristotle weighs in. And the big idea from the politics is the three forms of government, and then their virtuous and vicious forms. So monarch, king versus tyrant, aristocrats versus oligarchy, polity versus democracy. We also find in there that Aristotle agrees with the idea of the insight, the wisdom of crowds, which is interesting. That's something you don't often see on the right, but something that Aristotle was fond of, believed to be true. For also political politics, we have Machiavelli's The Prince, we have the Discourse on Livy, His Art of War, and the Florentine Histories, which all I've read. The Prince, some people argue is a satire. I'm not sure that I follow them on that. For example, Rousseau and other Enlightenment thinkers said it was a satire. But given how ruthless the de Medicis were, and that Machiavelli dedicated the Prince Lorenzo de Medici, it's quite likely that he was giving a handbook to be, cruel, or at least how to maintain power under that kind of situation where in Italy at the time, you could easily be ousted by a coup. And so a certain sense of ruthlessness was required. But what's interesting here is I think this is where we run into a little bit of trouble with understanding Machiavelli, because most people just read The Prince because it's the shortest of his works. But, consider the context in which he wrote this. He wrote this to a prince who wasn't necessarily on good terms with him. And I don't think that's truly reflective of Machiavelli's own thoughts. The Discourse on Livy, Livy being the Roman historian, who wrote the history of Rome from its founding up to Augustus, is a commentary on Republican government. And a lot of stuff that he says in The Prince seems to be contradicted in the Discourses on Livy. And I think that contradiction can be resolved because there's two different forms of government. As Machiavelli said in The Prince, there are two forms of government, aristocracies and republics. And for aristocracies, monarchy, the sort of harsh measures he's stating are suited for that. Whereas in a republic, where you have the common good and there's this idea of virtue, which he brings up a lot, which is the Roman concept of the virtues necessary for manly action, is the idea that you can use gentle is maybe not the right word, but more consensual decision making. And that's where we get, in both The Prince and the Discourse, though, he says basically the most armed people are the most free, and he refers to the Swiss. He also makes a pro-Second Amendment argument in the Discourses that only a tyrant and a coward would disarm his people, which is consistent with Aristotle, because a tyrant is someone who does not trust his people and hires foreigners. So in that regard, Machiavelli is not out of... So in a sense, Machiavelli's not out of step with Aristotle's reading of politics, and maybe not the advocate of, might makes right, or the ends justify the means, as some people think in an absolute sense. The Art of War is his attempt to account for how we can take classical forms of war and update them for the then modern age of the Renaissance in order to empower Italian city-states to achieve unification. Because the theme of all four of these works is the unification of Italy. Machiavelli was an Italian patriot. He highlighted the ancient Romans because they unified Italy. And he viewed any future unification of Italy as something that would likely happen under similar circumstances. The fact that they didn't happen under similar circumstances, in part due to a post-industrial revolution society, are things that likely Machiavelli could not have been expected to be aware of. The Florentine Histories are his account of Florence. Now, what's interesting about the Florentine Histories is he talks about Cosimo de' Medici, who predates the author of, or the prince he was referring to in The Prince. And he says that when Cosimo was exiled, it was the great love of the people that they had for him in the city that he eventually came back. But in The Prince, he says it's better to be feared than... So in The Prince, he says it is better to be feared than loved. But in the Florentine Histories, he says it's better to be loved than feared because Cosimo comes back from exile because of the love of the citizens. One possible reading of The Prince, then, is that he's intentionally giving bad advice because he doesn't like the guy that's in charge. So if he gives him bad advice, maybe it'll get him, killed or taken out of power. So now in English literature, we have Beowulf, which is great. Everybody should read Beowulf. That inspired Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, obviously. It's primarily a story set in the transitional period between pagan Anglo-Saxon Britain and Christian Anglo-Saxon Britain, and fighting of the monsters that many, believe that medievals believed were populated throughout, the ancient world, ancients and medievals. So Grendel and Grendel's mother are descendants of, Cain, There's a dragon, probably has some obviously reference to Lucifer. And of course, Beowulf, in a sort of Christ-like sense, fights the dragon, but then dies in the process. So that's Beowulf. We have Malory's The Death of Arthur, which is the sort of classic retelling of the Arthur cycle, first written down in the English with Monmouth in the 12th century. But what's interesting about the Arthur saga is that it's one that grows in the telling, and it's sort of like built in. Like a lot of times, you can say, well, you're not supposed to like retcon stories. You're not supposed to add to them. I guess you could with Troy, because that's what Homer, Virgil, and Dante did. But we see the same thing with Arthur. So Lancelot wasn't in the original telling. But in the 15th century with Malory's The Death of Arthur, we sort of get the first holistic account of the entire Arthurian saga. And I think the big idea here for Malory is that you can have this this golden age, so to speak, of right and justice under Arthur. But there's, on the one hand, in order to gain power, you have to do some pretty dirty things. I mean, Arthur basically goes all King Herod at one point, trying to kill Mordred by having the young men, the young boys, killed in the town where he thinks Mordred was born. But Mordred escapes and then eventually revenges himself on his father. And throughout, we see that the Knights of the Round Table, especially on the Grail quest, keep on faltering based on moral failing. And it's their moral failing that prevents them from seeing the Grail. And ultimately, once the Grail quest is completed, and not Lancelot, his son Galahad goes into essentially is translated into heaven, and it's done. Then there's a sort of like brooding civil war that develops between Arthur and Lancelot over Guinevere, and then of course the return of Mordred. And it's like the once the divine leaves, there's a vacuum now. The Shekinah glory's gone, and then at least the civil war where all of Arthur's demons come back to get him, and then the whole realm falls into disarray. Of course, I've already mentioned Shakespeare. I've already mentioned Milton. I've already mentioned Dickens. So that's again classic English literature, which I've already mentioned. As well, it probably goes without saying that C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia and Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings are excellent works as well to be read. So with the Chronicles of Narnia, as I've said in other places, the main point here is that Lewis is teaching us lessons in a fictional world that we can then learn from and apply in our own lives today. So that's the really, really big idea. But one of the some other, like, there's so much to say about Narnia, I can't hope to say it all here, but some other big ideas and trends that I find to be really interesting about Narnia is with the character of Lucy Pevensey. She represents the childlike faith. She's always the first one to see Aslan, whereas the other children usually have to take some time to come online before they can see Aslan. So I think in that regard, Lucy Pevensey is supposed to be C.S. Lewis's expression in literature of what Christ said, that you should have the faith of a child. The other thing that we see is that, you can achieve forgiveness, right? So Edmund was a traitor. In the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Eustace was an ass. And in fact, Edmund says, well, your first visit to Narnia was better than mine. You were only an ass. I was a traitor. And so the idea being that, well, there is the ability to come around. Also, evil will pretend to give you what you're already going to get anyhow. So the witch is pretending to give Diggory the apple. And then you have the witch pretending to give Edmund the crown. And then you have the witch of the green girdle pretending to give Aurelian the kingdom, all of which they're going to get anyhow by right. And so it's a sort of repetition of that sort of satanic theme that we see. Lord of the Rings, the big ideas there obviously are, biggest idea is the idea of the eucatastrophe. So as a Catholic, as a Christian, Tolkien says that, Christians broadly have no right to give up hope. because we know that God is in control. And so in order, setting this in a sort of pre-Christian era where these are essentially enlightened pagans, there's still this idea of the eucatastrophe, which ultimately ends with the destruction of the ring. But if you've watched my series on Middle-earth battles, you can see that there's also myriad minor eucatastrophes throughout, where, little turns here, little turns there that weren't expected by Saruman or Sauron are decisive in bringing a victory to the free peoples. So that's one big idea. Another big idea is industrialization. Tolkien was a noted critic of industrialization. Of course, Saruman specifically, but even to a lesser extent, Sauron, because represents industrial production. And so, of course, he has this great reversal where the Ents and the Horns tear down the trees, tear down the forges of Isengard. And that was actually, so there's interesting, there's two elements of Shakespeare that come into the Lord of the Rings. At least one for sure, then one I think is possible. So the first one is at Macbeth, where men dress up with gluing leaves to their shirts and carrying branches, and people are like, oh, the woods are moving, and Tolkien's like, oh, that's a joke. I'm going to do it right when I do it. And so there's a culminating fight. So that becomes the Ents. There's a culminating fight at the end of Macbeth. Duncan was the good guy. I forget who the villain was. And the villain said he was not to be killed by anyone born of a woman. He claims to have been born by a C-section, which is kind of a cop-out. And I have to wonder if that's where Eowyn and the Witch King come from. So that's an interesting thing. And then, of course, you see the scouring of the Shire, where the Shire itself is touched and tainted by evil and industrialization. And the idea here is that the struggle and the battle against evil will leave scars. It's another big idea. Leave scars on land, leave scars on people. So, right, Frodo, after being stabbed by the Witch King, he can't ever fully come to peace again, which is why he has to go to the Undying Lands before he finally dies. I mean, he's still mortal. He won't live forever. But there's that as well. The other thing is individual heroism, right? Obviously, from fighting in the trenches in World War I, there's a common phrase that starts to get thrown around. This isn't war, this is murder. And you see this with the early industrial combat, World War I, World War II, Korea, other places. And it's because machines make killing so easy that it feels effortless. And there's no honor or dignity in it. And what I think with the orcs represent being these, battalions of nameless, faceless cogs marching to their death, he's trying to say, well, there's a chance for the heroic to win. Now, there is, but we also see too, though, as anyone who's watched my Siege of the Hornburg and Siege of Gondor, that through what we might call gunpowder, he doesn't call it that, but blasting powder, we begin to see that, through art and contrivance, you can overcome courage. It doesn't matter how brave you are. Aragorn is sitting on the parapet over the Hornburg, and he gets away right before they blow up the gate to the actual citadel with blasting powder, which would have killed Aragorn had he not gotten off the face. So this is a very early stage, I guess you could say, of quasi-industrial warfare, and due to the eucatastrophe of Frodo destroying the ring, as well as the heroes themselves, and all these other minor eucatastrophes, they win. We also see the power, the ultimate power of resignation, where you resign power. And that's actually a theme that Nathan C.J. Hood and I will get into more detail on the 28th. But I'll just suffice it to say here, Tom Bombadil, the ring has no power on him. And it has no power over him because he resigns power. And then Frodo and the council resign the power of the ring by throwing it away. Boromir seeks it. Saruman seeks it. Denethor seeks it. And it all turns to their ruin. The other thing that we see as a big idea is, be charitable to evil even when they don't deserve it, because ultimately they'll be the cause of their own demise. Saruman's own demise and Wormtongue's own demise and Gollum's own demise are key examples of this. So that is about it. 40 minutes. So yeah, the first part here is what is the machine and why is it bad? All of these authors. And then everything since then is uh my list, and this again, there's so much more that you could read, but this is what I've read. And all of these point to you, what does life outside the simulation machine look like? All right, chats. What do we got? Euthanasia. Hooray, the reading list. Yes. Okay, yes. M. Dante is a real literary wild man. Divine Comedy is a great read. M. The Bible, aka the only book better than The Art of the Deal. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Vingle, I acquired Paradise Lost recently, likely to sit on the shelf for a while. Well, Vingle, maybe you should get the audiobook. Let's see. Ahab definitely is influenced by Milton's Satan. Yep. Let's see here. Vingle, speaking of ships, what about the Abri Martin series? Master and Commander. Well, I don't know anything about the book series, but the movie was excellent. So if the book series is anything like the movie, probably. Euthanasia. I like Poe's Masquerade of the Red Death short story. Not read that, at least if I have, I don't remember. I wanted to like War and Peace, but outside of the Austerlitz section and Tolstoy's rants on Napoleon, I found it kind of boring. If I'm being honest, I definitely prefer Dostoevsky. You're on thin ice there, Em. You're on thin ice. Careful. Let's see. Vingle, Poe is pretty darn great. Yeah, he is. Vingle, lol, I was reading Lovecraft and Poe this time last year. Great autumnal reading. Well, Vingle, I'm not going to tell you yet, but I will be doing some Lovecraft stuff early next month. So yeah, Lovecraft is great. I didn't include him on this list because he's not really telling you how to get outside the simulation, but he's great nonetheless. I think Ajax is Sophocles' best play. Interesting. Shakespeare is also sure to give the Tudors some props at the end of Richard III. Yeah. Vingle. The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories is a great little section of stories. I got the full work after reading that. Well, Call of Cthulhu is very good. The Call of Cthulhu was the first Lovecraft story I read. Minoan. I only read The Mountains of Madness for Lovecraft. Loved it. Yep, that's a classic one. Vingle. Lovecraft's largest inspiration was Poe, BTW, many similarities, but almost a century apart. Yep. Euthanasia, coward, brave, rash. Bingo, bingo. Yep. Taming of the Shrew is actually pretty funny and unbelievably based by 2022 standards. yeah, I bet it is. Comedy of Errors is pretty good too, but I also am less fond of his comedies. Euthanasia, deficient, correct, excess. Yep. Euthanasia. I think Machiavelli just wanted a strong United League regardless of the cost. At that time at least. Possibly. Let's see. Vingle. I have Shakespeare's complete work in one volume. Like how I'm going to read that. Well, you should, Vingle. I do too, but I haven't read that to get these stories per se. Let's see. Minoan, I don't enjoy reading Shakespeare or watching. It's cool. Well, have you thought about listening to Shakespeare? It's like in between. Try that, maybe. See what that does. Frederick the Great goes really hard at Machiavelli and is anti-Machiavel. I do think he takes the fact his family has a long history of being considered legitimate rulers of Brandenburg for. Vingle, I feel the same way about theater as Tolkien did. I don't know how Tolkien thought about it. Granted, while Machiavelli is dealing with a much less stable situation in Italy. Minoan, I once read all of Oscar Wilde's plays. I enjoyed them. Funny. Yeah, I've never read Oscar Wilde. Bingle, I have a La Morte d'Arthur, but haven't read it. Classic. I read it once. Minoan, I don't think Oscar Wilde made Todd's reading list, though. No, he didn't. Let's see. Vingle, speaking of the Arthurian legend, though, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is fantastic. Read it 3 times and we'll reread it, and we'll read it many more. I have the Tolkien translation. Based. Let's see. Vingle, must get around to it eventually, a bit intimidating, but I have to read it all at once, obviously. Yeah, I don't know which book you're referring to. To my shame, I have yet to read Narnia. Wow, and I thought Vingle was on thin ice. Now you're on thin ice, M. Let's see. Vingle, we're talking C.S. Lewis, not Dr. Dre. Let's see. Vingle, The Lord of the Rings, greater than other books. Yeah. I wish there were more books that made me... Minoan, I wish there were more books that made me feel like I did when the hobbits went back to the Shire and kicked the butt out of Sharky and his henchmen. Vingle, Tolkien mentions that he thought the Dunsinane Hill scene in Macbeth was so weak. Okay, Todd said it. Yeah, there I did. Let's see here. Vingle, on that note, Throne of Blood 1957 is an adaptation of Macbeth, set in feudal Japan, directed by Akira Kurosawa with Toshiro Mifune in the lead. Yes, and another good Akira Kurosawa Shakespeare-inspired film is Ran, which is inspired after King Lear. Ahab the Arab, king of the burning sand. M, I love getting warned by Todd. I'll get my act together. Well, all right, everyone. I did the reading list. Thanks for showing up. Don't forget, if you haven't already, to go to Locals, subscribe, and support me there. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.